Hi everyone, this is Andrea Mackenzie from Toronto, about to begin on a new L.M. Montgomery Odyssey, Magic for Marigold. Today I'll be reading Chapter 1, the first half. Some of the chapters in this book are quite long, so I split them in two. So first part today, second part on Thursday. And so that you know, for some reason I can't find my first edition Magic for Marigold, so I am reading the Canadian Favorites edition. Magic for Marigold by L.M. Montgomery. And the dedication is to Nora in memory of a world that has passed away. Today I'll be reading the first half of Chapter 1, What's in a Name? Once upon a time, which when you come to think of it is really the only proper way to begin a story, the only way that really smacks of romance and fairyland, all the Harmony members of the Leslie clan had assembled at Cloud of Spruce to celebrate old grandmother's birthday as usual. Also to name Lorraine's baby. It was a crying shame, as Aunt Nina pathetically said, that the little darling had been in the world 4 whole months without a name. But what could you do with poor dear Leander dying in that terribly sudden way, just 2 weeks before his daughter was born, and poor Lorraine being so desperately ill for weeks and weeks afterwards? Not very strong yet, for that matter. And there was tuberculosis in her family, you know. Aunt Nina was not really an aunt at all, at least not of Eddie Leslie. She was just a cousin. It was the custom of the Leslie caste to call everyone uncle or aunt as soon as he or she had become too old to be fitly called by a first name among the young fry. There will be no end of these aunts and uncles bobbing in and out of this story, as well as several genuine ones. I shall not stop to explain what kind they were. It doesn't matter. They were all Leslies or married to Leslies. That was all that mattered. You were born to the purple if you were a Leslie. Even the pedigrees of their cats were known. All the Leslies adored Lorraine's baby. They had all agreed in loving Leander, about the only thing they had ever been known to agree on. And it was 30 years since there had been a baby at Cloud of Spruce. Old grandmother had more than once said gloomily that the good old stock was running out. So this small lady's advent would have been hailed with delirious delight if it hadn't been for Leander's death and Lorraine's long illness. Now that old grandmother's birthday had come, the Leslies had an excuse for their long-deferred jollification. As for the name, no Leslie baby was ever named until every relative within get-outable distance had had his or her say in the matter. The selection of a suitable name was, in their eyes, a much more important thing than the mere christening. And how much more in the case of a fatherless baby whose mother was a sweet soul enough, but, you know, a Winthrop. Cloud of Spruce, the original Leslie homestead, where old grandmother and young grandmother and Mrs. Leander and the baby and Salome Silversides lived, was on the harbor shore, far enough out of Harmony Village to be in the real country. A cream brick house, a nice chubby old house, so covered with vines that it looked more like a heap of ivy than a house. A house that had folded its hands and said, "I will rest." Before it was the beautiful Harmony Harbor, with its purring waves so close that in autumnal storms the spray dashed over the very doorsteps and encrusted the windows. Behind it was an orchard that climbed the slope, and about it always the soft sighing of the big spruce wood on the hill. The birthday dinner was eaten in old grandmother's room, which had been called the orchard room until old grandmother, 2 years back, had cheerfully and calmly announced that she was tired of getting up before breakfast and working between meals. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life being waited on," she said. "I've had 90 years of slaving for other people. and bossing them, the Leslies said in their hearts. But not out loud, for it did really seem at times as if old grandmother's ears could hear for miles. Uncle Ebenezer had said something once about old grandmother to himself in his cellar at midnight, when he knew he was the only human being in the house. Next Sunday afternoon, old grandmother cast it up to him. She said Lucifer had told her. Lucifer was her cat. And Uncle Ebenezer suddenly remembered that his cat had been sitting on the edge of the potato bin when he said that. It was safest not to say things about old grandmother. Old grandmother's room was a long, dim green apartment running across the south end of the house, with a glass door opening right into the orchard. Its walls were hung with photographs of Leslie brides for 60 years back, most of them with enormous bouquets and wonderful veils and trains. Clementine's photograph was among them. Clementine, Leander's first wife, who had died 6 years ago with her little unnamed daughter. Old grandmother had it hanging on the wall at the foot of her bed so that she could see it all the time. Old grandmother had been very fond of Clementine. At least, she always gave Lorraine that impression. The picture was good to look at. Clementine Leslie had been very beautiful. She was not dressed as a bride. In fact, the picture had been taken just before her marriage and had a clan fame as Clementine with the lily. She was posed standing with her beautiful arms resting on a pedestal and in one slender, perfect hand. Clementine's hands had become a tradition of loveliness. She held a lily at which she was gazing earnestly. Old grandmother had told Lorraine once that a distinguished guest at Cloud of Spruce, an artist of international fame, had exclaimed on seeing that picture, "Exquisite hands, hands into which a man might fearlessly put his soul." Lorraine had sighed and looked at her rather thin little hands. Not beautiful, scarcely even pretty, yet Leander had once kissed their fingertips and said... But Lorraine did not tell old grandmother what Leander had said. Perhaps old grandmother might have liked her better if she had. Old grandmother had her clock in the corner by the bed, a clock that had struck for the funerals and weddings and goings and comings and meetings and partings of 5 generations. The grandfather clock her husband's father had brought out from Scotland 140 years ago. The Leslies plumed themselves on being Prince Edward Island pioneer stock. It was still keeping excellent time, and old grandmother got out of bed every night to wind it. She would have done that if she had been dying. Her other great treasure was in the opposite corner, a big glass case with Alicia, the famous Skinner doll, in it. Old grandmother's mother had been a Skinner, and the doll had no part in Leslie traditions, but every Leslie child had been brought up in the fear and awe of it and knew its story. Old grandmother's mother's sister had lost her only little daughter of 3 years and had never been quite right afterwards. She had had a waxen image of her baby maid and kept it beside her always and talked to it as if it had been alive. It was dressed in a wonderful embroidered dress that had belonged to the dead baby and wore one of her slippers. The other slipper was held in one waxen hand, ready for the small bare foot that peeped out under the muslin flounces. The doll was so lifelike that Lorraine always shuddered when she passed it, and Salome Silversides was very doubtful of the propriety of having such a thing in the house at all, especially as she knew that Lazare, the French hired man, thought and told that it was the old lady's saint and believed she prayed before it regularly. But all the Leslies had a certain pride in it. No other Prince Edward Island family could boast a doll like that. It conferred a certain distinction upon them, and tourists wrote it up in their local papers when they went home. Of course, the cats were present at the festivity also. Lucifer and the Witch of Endor, both of black velvet with great round eyes. Cloud of Spruce was noted for its breed of black cats with topaz-hued eyes. Its kittens were not scattered broadcast, but given away with due discrimination. Lucifer was old grandmother's favorite, a remote, subtle cat, an inscrutable cat so full of mystery that it fairly oozed out of him. The Witch of Endor became her name, but compared to Lucifer, she was commonplace. Salome wondered secretly that old grandmother wasn't afraid of a judgment for calling a cat after the old Harry. Salome liked cats in their place, but she was furious when Uncle Quan said to her once, "Salome Silversides, why, you ought to be a cat yourself with a name like that. A sleek, purring, plushy Maltese." "I'm sure I don't look like a cat," said Salome, highly insulted, and Uncle Quan agreed that she did not. Old grandmother was a gnomish dame of 92 who meant to live to be 100. A tiny, shrunken, wrinkled thing with flashing black eyes. There was a puckish hint of malice in most things she said or did. She ruled the whole Leslie clan and knew everything that was said and done in it. If she had given up slaving, she certainly had not given up bossing. Today she was propped up on crimson cushions, with a fresh, frilled white cap tied around her face, eating her dinner heartily, and thinking things not lawful to be uttered about her daughters-in-law and her granddaughters-in-law and her great-granddaughters-in-law. Part 2. Young grandmother, a mere lass of 65, sat at the head of the table. A tall, handsome lady with bright, steel-blue eyes and white hair, whom old grandmother thought a somewhat pert young thing. There was nothing of the traditional grandmother of caps and knitting about her. She was like a stately old princess in her purple velvet gown with its wonderful lace collar. The gown had been made 8 years before, but when young grandmother wore anything, it seemed at once in the height of the fashion. Most of the Leslies present thought she should not have laid aside her black even for a birthday dinner. But young grandmother did not care what they thought any more than old grandmother did. She had been a Blaisdell, one of the stubborn Blaisdells, and the Blaisdell traditions were as good as the Leslie traditions any day. Lorraine sat on the right of young grandmother at the table with the baby in her cradle beside her. Because of the baby, she had a certain undeniable importance never before conceded her. All the Leslies had been more or less opposed to Leander's second choice. Only the fact that she was a minister's daughter appeased them. She was a shy, timid, pretty creature, quite insignificant except for her enormous masses of lustrous, pale gold hair. Her small face was sweet and flower-like, and she had peculiarly soft gray-blue eyes with long lashes. She looked very young and fragile in her black dress, but she was beginning to be a little happy once more. Her arms, that had reached out so emptily in the silence of the night, were filled again. The fields and hills around Cloud of Spruce that had been so stark and bare and chill when her little lady came were green and golden now, spilled over with blossoms, and the orchard was an exquisite, perfumed world by itself. One could not be altogether unhappy in springtime with such a wonderful, unbelievable baby. The baby lay in the old Heppel-white cradle where her father and grandfather had lain before her, a quite adorable baby with a saucy little chin, tiny hands as exquisite as the apple blossoms, eyes of fairy blue, and the arrogant, superior smile of babies before they have forgotten all the marvelous things they know at first. Lorraine could hardly eat her dinner for gazing at her baby and wondering, would this tiny thing ever be a dancing, starry-eyed girl, a white bride, a mother? Lorraine shivered. It did not do to look so far ahead. Aunt Anne got up, brought a shawl, and tenderly put it around Lorraine's shoulders. Lorraine was almost melted, for the June day was hot, but she wore the shawl all through dinner rather than hurt Aunt Anne's feelings. That one fact described Lorraine. On young grandmother's left sat Uncle Klondike, the one handsome, mysterious, unaccountable member of the Leslie clan, with his straight, heavy eyebrows, his flashing blue eyes, his mane of tawny hair, and the red gold beard which had caused a sentimental Harmony lady of uncertain years to say that he made her think of those splendid old Vikings. Uncle Klondike's real name was Horace, but ever since he had come back from the Yukon with gold dropping out of his pockets, he had been known as Klondike Leslie. His deity was the god of all wanderers, and in his service, Horace Leslie had spent wild, splendid, adventurous years. When Klondike had been a boy at school, he had a habit of looking at certain places on the map and saying, "I'll go there." Go he did. He had stood on the southernmost boulder of Ceylon and sat on Buddhist cairns at the edges of Tibet. The Southern Cross was a POW, and he had heard the songs of nightingales in the gardens of the Alhambra. India and the China Seas were to him as a tale that is told, and he had walked alone in great Arctic spaces under northern lights. He had lived in many places, but he had never thought of any of them as home. That name had all unconsciously been kept sacred to the long, green, seaward-looking glen where he had been born. And finally, he had come home, sated, to live the rest of his life a decent, law-abiding clansman, whereof the conclusive sign and token was that he had trimmed his mustache and beard into decency. The mustache had been particularly atrocious. Its ends hung down nearly as far as his beard did. When Aunt Anne asked him despairingly why on earth he wore a mustache like that, he retorted that he wrapped it round his ears to keep them warm. The clan were horribly afraid he meant to go on wearing them, for Uncle Klon was both Leslie and Blaisdell. He finally had them clipped, though he could never be induced to go the length of a clean-shaven face, fashion or no fashion. But, though he went to bed early at least once a week, he still savored life with gusto, and the clan were always secretly much afraid of him and his satiric winks and cynical speeches. Aunt Nina, in particular, had held him in terror, ever since the day she had told him proudly that her husband had never lied to her. "Oh, you poor woman," said Uncle Klon, with real sympathy in his tone. Nina supposed there was a joke somewhere, but she could never find it. She was a WCTU and an IODE and most of the other letters of the alphabet, but somehow she found it hard to get the hang of Klondike's jokes. Klondike Leslie was known to be a woman-hater. He scoffed openly at all love, more especially the supreme absurdity of love at first sight. This did not prevent his clan from trying for years to marry him off. It would be the making of Klondike if he had a good wife who would stand no nonsense. They were very obvious about it, and with the renowned Leslie frankness, recommended several excellent brides to him. But Klondike Leslie was notoriously hard to please. Catherine Nichols? But look at the thick ankles of her. Emma Goodfellow? Her mother used to call out meow in church whenever the minister said something she didn't like. Can't risk heredity. Rose Osborne? I can't stand a woman with pudgy hands. Sarah Jennett? An egg without salt. Lottie Parks? I'd like her as a flavoring, not as a dish. Ruth Russell, triumphantly, as having at last hit upon a woman with whom no reasonable man could find fault. Too peculiar. When she has nothing to say, she doesn't talk. That's really too uncanny in a woman, you know. Dorothy Porter? Ornamental by candlelight, but I don't believe she'd look so well at breakfast. Amy Ray? Always purring, blinking, sidling, clawing. Nice small pussycat, but I'm no mouse. Agnes Barr? A woman who says Coué's formula instead of her prayers. Olive Purdy? Tongue, temper, and tears. Go sparingly, thank you. Even old grandmother took a hand and met with no better success. She was wiser than to throw any one girl at his head. The men of the Leslie clan never had married the women picked out for them, but she had her own way of managing things. He travels the fastest who travels alone, was all she could get out of Klondike. Very clever of you, said old grandmother, if traveling fast is all there is to life. Not clever of me. Don't you know your Kipling, grandmother? What is a Kipling? Said old grandmother. Uncle Klondike did not tell her. He merely said he was doomed to die a bachelor and could not escape his kismet. Old grandmother was not a stupid woman, even if she didn't know what a Kipling was. You've waited too long. You've lost your appetite, she said shrewdly. The Leslies gave it up. No use trying to fit this exasperating relative with a wife. A bachelor, Klon remained with an awful habit of wiring sincere sympathy whenever any of his friends got married. Perhaps it was just as well. His nephews and nieces might benefit, especially Lorraine's baby, whom he evidently worshipped. So here he was, unwedded, light-hearted, and content, watching them all with his amused smile. Lucifer had leaped on his knee as soon as he had sat down. Lucifer condescended to very few, but, as he told the Witch of Endor, Klondike Leslie had a way with him. Uncle Klon fed Lucifer with bits from his own plate, and Salome, who ate with the family because she was a fourth cousin of Jane Lyle, who had married the stepbrother of a Leslie, thought it ghastly. That ends part 1 and 2 of chapter 1 of Magic for Marigold. I will be back in just a few days with the second half of the chapter. Thanks for listening. That's all for now. Bye from Andrea.